Hi, welcome to Druid Talks. I'm MG Boutet. Today we will be talking about French-Canadian oral traditions and folklore. And just to contextualize a bit, French Canada was founded, as we all know, by Champlain in 1608, Acadia in 1604 by one of Champlain's collaborators. And so the French Canadians have been in North America for quite a while. They were a tight-knit society. The French Canadian settlers were apart from the Native Americans or Native Canadian tribes who were around in north, south, and west and east of the St. Lawrence River Valley. And so the French settlers interacted very little with the Native Americans unless it was for trade. Early on, things were organized along a seigneurial system of seigneurial tenures, which was exactly as it was during the old regime in France. And so there was lordships and serfs, and all of these people worked together to, let's say, support the Catholic institutions which were in Quebec City and the other cities such as Trois-Rivières and Montreal later on. And so much of what the French settlers produced went to the very numerous communities, Catholic communities, the nuns and the bishop of Quebec City, Monseigneur Laval. So the French Canadians were mainly from Western France and were let's say of a old regime type, unlike the settlers of New England, who were mainly urban, from the bourgeoisie, who were literate Protestants who, when in New England, were living in townships where there were towns and cities. As for in French Canada, the seigneuries were local agricultural communities, and which was quite different from what we had in, let's say, in the British colonies. And so, evidently, when these people left France, they left with entire families, with their little of their belongings. Everything had to be redone here, but they had skills nevertheless. They were skilled in different trades. There were carpenters and barrel makers and smiths and all the masons and all of these types. And so very early on in Quebec, when Champlain had set up his colony there, he was surrounded with all sorts of tradesmen who were there in the colony, in St. Lawrence River Valley. Of course, there were other places where there were lots of Europeans. The Basques were all along the shores of the lower St. Lawrence, all the way to Tadoussac. Many of these Basques came for the summer. Some left for the winter, but there was always much activity there. There were also Breton fishermen from Brittany, from Armorica. There were some also from the Gulf of Gascogne who were Basques, and there was also, some believe, when the Greenland colony ceased, many of the people who were in Greenland ended up in these outposts along the St. Lawrence River Valley. So when Champlain came up, the local Amerindians, the Montagnais or the Innu people, were already accustomed to the presence of Europeans, and they even had their own pidgin, a dialect based on Basque and French and Algonquian vocabulary, which was a mixed language, and this helped a lot of the Europeans to speak with the natives. So there was much happening since 1534 when Cartier came, and later on when Champlain arrived in 1608. So he was just there to establish the French presence of the French crown, of the French king. And so, but before that, the eastern part was effectively known as New Brittany. And so when François Ier took over the Duchy of Brittany, he inherited many of these territories which were exploited by the Breton mariners and fishermen. So this is gives you quite a good picture. So when in the Champlain's fort that he had built in Quebec, he had many people from France with him there, many settlers, and the community grew. One of his collaborators, he was from Normandy, from Perche, and he went through in the countryside and gathered a lot of people from there to come to settle in Canada. And Giffard, his name was. And then after that, under Jean Talon, there came many people, peasants from Brittany and Poitou. So there was the biggest contingent of settlers came from these areas afterwards. And so what you have there is an earlier population that was mainly Norman, with a bit of Parisians there, like the Hébert, the apothecary of Quebec, and Brûlé also, who was a translator for for Champlain with the Indians. And so afterwards, the main population was from that part of Armorica and Vendée, north of Poitou. And this is what we have here. Most of the lore that we have is based on Gallo-Roman culture, pre-Christian, which is in the French-Canadian tradition. A lot of these things were recorded and kept in the archives of the University of Laval by the first modern anthropologists. And the most important of these, of course, is Marius Barbeau. And so this is, since he's quite an important figure in this collect of ethnic material, it would be silly to sort of not mention Marius Barbeau. Marius Barbeau was a Rhodes Scholar. He was a Canadian anthropologist and ethnologist, folklorist, and he studied both at the Sorbonne in Paris and at Oxford University in England, where he studied under Tyler and Marett. He was there. He was a co-student of the New Zealand-born anthropologist Diamond Gennis, who worked much collecting work for the National Museum of Ottawa and the Smithsonian Institute on the Native American and Canadian traditions. And Barbeau did also the same, but when in New York in 1914 at the annual gathering of the American Folklore Society, the German-born American anthropologist Franz Boas asked the young Marius Barbeau if there was any old folk tales, such as the bygone fairy tales of Europe in Canada, in French Canada. And Barbeau caught a bit off guard. He told Boas that he knew of the 19th century French-Canadian writers such as Louis Fréchette. There was also Aubert de Gaspé, father and son, who were heavily inspired from the local folk tales and traditions. In fact, the Aubert de Gaspé family, they were right in the midst of it, since they were lords of the seigneurie of Saint-Jean-Port-Joli, and where they were in direct contact with steeped in the tradition. So when in Quebec City, what Barbeau did is he remembered that the Sioux family, the Huron-Wendat people of Lorette, they were quite good at storytelling. So he went there, and what he heard was French-Canadian tales, such as, or of French origin or European origin, such as The Princess and the Seven Green Mountains, The Water of the Fountain of Paris, and The Soulless Body. The Soulless Body, which of course is a very well-known Breton, Celtic, Brittonic mythological tale, and so he was quite sad about this, disappointed, because he was looking for raw native Canadian material, which he didn't get, and he remembered that Boas had told him that while collecting Native American material all over the territory of the United States, he heard that the Indians were recounting tales and legends that many of them were basically European, but Northern European or Western European, and not especially typical of those that you'd expect from, let's say, the Spanish people or the Portuguese, and so, or even the English people of New England. So he was wondering where this material came from, and so he had sent Barbeau collecting these, and indeed he had sent Barbeau on a colossal grail quest, which would keep him busy for the rest of his life. The material there gathered was so voluminous. It was absolutely incredible. Never had he imagined he'd be working so long. And so before he returned to his job in Ottawa at the National Archives there, he made a quick survey of the possible places where he'd find storytellers, and then at Saint-Victor he met this Paul Patry, who eloquently delivered 9 excellent traditional tales. This first contact had a great effect on the 31-year-old intellectual who was trained in Catholic school, steeped in classical Greek and Latin, and in fact, he had studied with the Christian Brothers at Saint Marie College, Saint-Anne de la Pocatière, where he later earned a bachelor's degree at the Seminary of Quebec, which became the Laval University. And so Barbeau evidently was shocked to find such a rich oral lore, deeply steeped in the tradition, which was very vibrant and actually living living culture. It wasn't something that was let's say artificial or something scholarly or something that was like the trend was in those days to read tales from books, the Grimm's books and those of Perrault in France and the Thousand and One Nights from Persia and things like that. No, this was very archaic medieval lore that was unexpected and quite surprisingly, these people were still alive, those who were spreading the tradition. So in the summer of July 1915, he stops in Beauce, which was his native region of Quebec, at his family's farm, and there he remembered that since his parents were of the peasantry, that some of the members of the family and his father knew Fabliaux by heart. The Fabliaux is a comical body, anonymous tale written and performed by jongleurs, minstrels, wandering musicians, bards of northern France around the 13th century. You have the same thing in England, of course, and several of them were recorded and reworked by Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived from 1340 to 1400. He was an English poet, and he was very well known, of course, for the Canterbury Tales, which probably many of you know. So Barbeau, he was very, very excited about all this, and he was fired by this major discovery. And so in 1915, he makes an address, speech to the Royal Canadian Society in Ottawa, in the urgent need to finance and scientifically record and set an archive of French-Canadian folklore. And during this talk, Barbeau described the negative effects of the sweeping blow of intellectual and material modernism, which was growing in the world, and that these songs, tales, and traditions, these relics of a bygone age, could possibly completely disappear. Even so that even in France, many of this living material had died away because of the French Revolution, of course, and the modern intellectual, the rationalist age of the illuminations, and so of the lights, and so you had to go into very backward places in France to actually find people who were still living the old pre-Christian culture, the Gallo-Roman type culture that was still alive in France during the old regime. So you'd have to go to Lower Brittany, in the hills of Normandy, or Vendée in Poitou, and Auvergne in the Massif Central, where there were people there who were still very versed in oral literature. And so, but surprisingly, in French Canada, in the St. Lawrence Valley, these traditions were still maintained and kept as they were during the old regime in France, and even so, even more diverse and more archaic, because Quebec was not touched by the French Revolution or by the modernization, the industrialization period, since it was mainly an agricultural, the St. Lawrence River Valley was mainly agricultural, and also it had been conquered by the English. And so during the Plains of Abraham, around the 1759, and so the English preserved the seigneurial system, the old, and even members of the British small aristocracy enjoyed having this kind of life, because they had the same in rural England, especially the Scots. The Scots were the ones to really start their own lordships around Quebec City. There was one in Murray Bay, which was in the Charlevoix region, at the mouth of the Saguenay River. There was others along before Baie-Saint-Paul, near l'Île aux Coudres. There was another one at Rivière-du-Loup, run by the Lord Fraser. So as you can see, there was interaction between the Scots and the French Canadians also. We'll get to know a bit more later on with the Aubert de Gaspé, who were pretty much involved in this. So Barbeau's talk had quite an effect to encourage many of the university professors to do research in these fields, especially there was much work also to do with the native Canadian peoples, and so Barbeau had to collect a team to study this. Therefore, from 1914 to 1918, Marius Barbeau had collected more than 200 tales already, had his financing, and so he got the collaboration of Edouard Zotzig-Massicotte, Adélard Lambert, who was the brother of Archange Godbout, one of the first lady collectors, anthropologists and ethnologists, and of J. Thomas Leblanc, who they all worked, some of them worked at their own expense. They went back to their native regions and they collected much material there. And then later on were added François Brassard, Madeleine Doyon, Carmen Roy, Félix Antoine Savard, very famous writer also, and Luc Lacourcière. So Barbeau, he knew he had to get more than what he got there at Lorette and around his parents' farm. And so he went to Cap Tourmente, which on the Charlevoix coast. He had heard that there in the Charlevoix region around Quebec City, around l'Île d'Orléans and all these islands in the St. Lawrence River were the last remnants of the medieval jongleurs and minstrels of Europe were still active there. And there, in this area here, the clock of time had stopped ticking. And this was the expression that was used by many of the anthropologists, even from the Smithsonian Institute, who were confronted by this. There, in the summer of 1916, Barbeau decides to go to Charlevoix and record these last surviving jongleurs, the troubadours. He had with him a stenographer and also a wax cylinder recorder. And one of the fine storytellers and singers he met was this elderly lady called Madame Bouchard, and she explains to him how things went about in those days. At home they would gather at night. Those who knew no tales sang songs, and those who knew no songs told tales. There were winter reunions, and we gathered often. Of course, this was also the same in Brittany, along the coast. When in the winter time it was really dark and wet, and there was storms, and so the fishermen and the farmers would gather at night and recite tales. And the native Canadians and Native Americans had the same habit of in the wintertime telling stories and keeping the mythology alive. So this is pretty much what most of the people were doing during the winter time at nights in order to it got dark very early, 3:30, 4 o'clock, and so there was nothing much to do, and this is what they said about doing after supper. And there he met one of the most famous of the jongleurs, the minstrels. His name was Louis l'Aveugle Simard, blind man Simard, who at that time he was a traveling troubadour, and he had stopped at Saint-Irénée because on the 26th of July at Sainte-Anne-de-Beaupré there was he had devotions to make to the Sainte Anne, who was the patron saint of the French Canadians at the time, and she was also patron saint of the Bretons, of course. Anna, or Sainte Anne, was the old goddess of the Celts, the mother of the gods and mother of the people. She was known in Ireland as De Dana, Anna, or Danu, and she was also known likewise in Brittany and in Gaul, where she was called Danu also, or Danawa in the old Celtic expression. And so in Quebec City, there one of the first institutions that were set after Champlain had organized things in the colony was the Société de Sainte-Anne, the Society of Sainte Anne, which was to protect and look after carpenters and the other trades such as masons. And so Sainte Anne was also the patroness of artisans, as you know, third function, as Dumézil would say, Indo-European third function. And so evidently Barbeau was struck by Simard's very impulsive and shameless mixed repartees and jokes, which he would spice his songs and his music with. He was ordinarily accompanied by the fiddle and the dulcimer, which he carried in a cart, just like the medieval minstrels. And whenever a remark was made, someone would, a heckler would poke a joke. He was quick to draw, and he would say "un trou, une cheville," which meant a hole and a crosspin, which is one of these Rabelaisian jokes, very spicy, and this would make many laugh, of course. As you know, the hole in the crosspin is a reference to some of the magic, fertility magic that was made in the country to encourage childbirth, and in medieval in medieval Europe, in the British Isles and in Ireland, there was a Shilanagig, you know, and the Menatol, and these things that were quite famous as the young peasant girls would go through this stone that was pierced as a bun, and this would bring about fertility, of course. And so these same practices were maintained in French Canada. Well, in the collecting phase, Barbeau and his Boisnian scholar friends, colleagues, were confronted by the fact that there was the Catholic Church, which was very structured, very doctrinarian, very literary, and the French Canadian society, which was almost 90% analphabet and illiterate, and these two things were surprising because the scholars had long suspected that in a very strong Catholic society, people, the paganizing and mysticizing and superstitions that were of the old pagan traditions could not survive because they would be choked out. But this was absolutely not the case. It was like a kettle, a boiler with the cover on. It doesn't mean that because the cover was on the boiler that the contents wouldn't boil up. What would happen is the cover would pop, and this is exactly what happened after the war. Second World War in 1945, the cover blew up and modern ways came into Quebec, and so from the 50s to the 60s there was lots of intellectualizing, and in early 60s with the Vatican Council, and when they took Latin out of the churches, the Catholic Church blew apart in Canada. The cover blew off, and this was called the Quiet Revolution. So, of course, many of these traditions were also taken away with the Catholic. So, to resume, to structuralize this paradox, the ethnic society, the intellectuals, the scholarly ethnologists who studied this French-Canadian paradox summed it in two parts. One, French-Canadian society was historically structured around the elitist Catholic Church. So it was structured around the elitist Catholic Church. So it doesn't mean that it was under the boot of the Catholic Church. Then French-Canadian culture was traditionally maintained through oral lore by hereditary transmission and teaching. So it was not just something that was entertaining and something that was passed on in family to pass time, family life, but it was a hereditary transmission and a teaching, hereditary. So the general trend within the anthropological and ethnological societies was to consider the Roman Catholic Church as the sole religious element organizing French-Canadian society and culture. And scholars traditionally cling to the notion that the Roman Catholic Church is the sole civilizing factor, and that the Christian religious mythology was discouraged. That the Christian religious mythology, with the saints and all, discouraged any other type of competing mythology. So this about sums it for that. That is that the experts failed to acknowledge the existence of an organized pagan lore and mythology because of this cultural bias. And so, therefore, they thought it would have been devoid of any religious or mystical content, and that there couldn't be any hierarchical, stratified sense of organization, structured organization, which wasn't the case at all. For example, even Barbeau, in one of his studies in Le Saguenay Légendaire, the legendary Saguenay, on page 111 and 112, he says about the Boilly family, who were traditional bone setters and healers. This comment here, he says, the origins of the Boilly are obscure, no doubt that they descended from a long line of healers whose art was passed on from father to son, owing to nothing borrowed in books, or nothing borrowed in books. And to this day, the Boilly sons, daughters, and grandchildren, or simply the cousins of Fabien, are reputed at the Escoumins, Lac Saint-Jean, Saint-Irénée, in Charlevoix, Quebec City, and even in Montreal as healers and bone setters. So this gives you a good idea. And Barbeau also admits that there were hereditary lines of sorcerers similar to the native shamans. And of course there was interactions with these two. Not that they copied each other, but that they would share tricks. In fact, the native healers would initiate the French Canadians to some of the medicinal plants they knew, and then the French Canadians would trade off some of the medicinal plants they had, which they cultivated, which were originally brought from Western France, from Brittany, and from Poitou, and areas like that. And so one other thing that they didn't expect was theonyms and mythonyms, that is, the names of the old religion, the old pre-Christian pagan Gallo-Roman religion, to be still in use, because what happens in folklore and fairy tales is that the names of the gods, goddesses, fairies, whatnot, they become, let's say, they're banalized, they're humorized. They're taken. Their religious content is taken away, and let's say, for example, the hag, the witch, the giant, the fairy, the elfin, instead of the actual names of the gods. But interestingly enough, in French Canada, as was the case in certain areas of Brittany and Poitou, these names were kept, as some of the from Western France, some of the old names like Mélusine la Fée. Mélusine, of course, was from Bélusine, Belisama, which was the Gallic goddess, similar to the goddess Bridget in Ireland, Brigindo in Old Celtic, Brigantia. Then there was also La Ciguine, which some people thought, since it rhymed with, punned with aiguine, a saw, but it does have the meaning of cutting. Ciguine was from Sequana, which was the name of the Seine River, which was very important probably to the people in Lower Normandy, and so that was maintained. Sequana, the water goddess, becomes a Ciguine in Canada. And then you have also Bossy-Bonny in Poitou, which was a toponymic goddess for the roadways, sort of like Biwana in Gaul, Vivienne La Fée in the Arthurian legends. So she was one of the French-Canadian names for Vivienne La Fée. The Bossy-Bonny is from, it means a way marker, a road marker. And this is pretty much in the old Poitou dialect, which was from Gallic, of course. But most important of all, these characters, these mythological characters, was Ti-Jean, Little John. But you'd say, well, what does Little John have to do with a Gallic character, a Gallic god? Well, it has all to do with a Gallic god. The one called Jesus, Jesus in later parlance. So from Hesus becomes Johannes, and then Jehan in Old French, and then Jean. So the name is transferred from Jesus to Johannes, and then becomes Jean. And another one of his names was Petit Jean, means small, little John, of course, as I said. So another of Petit Jean's names was Le Petit Bonyen, Le Petit Veillen. Le Petit Bonyen means the little good god, because Bonyen is a deformation of Bon Dieu. And a bit like in Ireland you have the Dagda, which was the good god. And so the Bonyen was the good god, Jesus was the good god. Jesus and Aizus, in Old Celtic it was from Esu, and with the suffix sos, os, or was, which in fact meant divine breath, or the breath, or it also connoted the terrible, the master, and the good. Esu means good. So there you have it again, the good god. And like Jesus, Ti-Jean was also a lumberjack, a woodcutter, a bit like the Greek Eros. He embodied the vital drives of sexuality and fertility, courage, master of trees, the forests and the animals, a divine woodcutter. He orders and disorganizes vegetation. He fells trees. He leads the divine cowherd. He is always accompanied with a bull. He could also be accompanied with a dog and a pig. He was always dressed in Gaelic art in Gaul, in a short tunic, the traditional dress of the Gallic lumberjacks. And in French Canada, Ti-Jean is dressed as we will see. There's a famous movie at the National Film Board surrounding Ti-Jean, and we'll see excerpts from it where Ti-Jean is pictured as a peewee, but very strong and mighty lumberjack. And also Ti-Jean was a juvenile. He was sort of like an eternal teenager, a teen adult, as we would say today. There was a similar deity, of course, in Hinduism as Vishnu. He was also a peewee shorty, but a mighty personage. And so it's along this same Indo-European tradition. Of course, Le Petit Bonyen was very well known in also the other French-Canadian settlements around the Great Lakes. He even pops up in American storytelling as the character of Paul Bunyan, popularized in 1916 by the American writer William Lougheed. Lived around 1882 to 1958. In his advertising booklet, sponsored by the Red River Lumber Company, and also the D. Lawrence Rogers Company. Paul Bunyan's exploits are based on the stories of the lumberjack Fabien Fournier. He was probably the one who retold the story of Le Petit Bonyen, or Ti-Jean, in 1845, 1875. Um, this Fabien Fournier was famous lumberjack from Detroit. He had worked at the Grayling HM Loud company in Michigan. And so this about sums it up for the mythology aspects of it. Of course, there's a lot more, so this is just a summary, a short summary. But back to the warlocks, the witches, and whatnot. The French Canadian witchcraft was organized along the lines of the la chouannerie or la chouannerie, depending on the dialect. The chouannerie was mainly around Normandy, and la chouannerie in Brittany and Poitou. And so both names were, both of these variants were used in French Canada, depending on the areas. Where does it come from? It comes from Chouan or Chat-Huant. It's an old Gaelic name, it comes from Kawanos, which meant owl in Gaulish. So the expression, the utterance was called la chouenne, which means to speak like an owl. And le chouanneux was the one who expressed it. A sorcerer was called a chouin or a chawin, depending on the regions. And chouiner meant to bespell, pronounce magic spells, to bewitch. And then there was another old French term that is carried on. It was called la voix dit in Old French, la voix dit, which meant wisdom. It was the same as the English word wisdom, same root, same etymology, Indo-European etymology. It comes from vidya or vidya in Gaelic and vidya in Sanskrit, which meant wisdom, knowing, science, and all this. And so it also connoted the woods. In the other Celtic languages, such as Breton, Wid, and Welsh, and also in Irish as Fid. So it's along these same lines. It's an old Celtic term that could have been understood by everybody. So the chouin or chouin was a barn owl and a wizard. And so the wizards would gather in chouannerie, which was the place where the owls, which was a clearing. The French Canadians never used the word couvent or convent or convent because of the Catholic connotations, and also because of the witch hunting, and of course it wasn't the traditional term that was used. And there were famous wizards and witches. One thing important to mention is that in French Canada there were more warlocks, male witches, than female witches. They were probably 10 to 1 in French Canada, because there was patrilineal as a transmission, and there was very hierarchical. hiérarchique, and so the transmission was often from master to pupil. And one of these famous sorcerers, as we will see, was called the Pape Giroux. But in Brittany, they also had, even in the modern age, in the early 1900s, they also had famous wizards. One was Loïc Coz, Loïc the Elder, or Loïc the Old. He was from Saint-Ouen in Finistère in Brittany, and Loïc was a traditional warlock who acted as a natural healer and bone setter. He was also known to cast spells, recite magical formulas, destined to bewitch lovers, and 400 crowns he would make somebody lucky at games. And in exchange he would ask just for a small reparation, a hen or a few coins. Let's not forget that it was a bad sign for someone to be rich when you were a poor peasant under Catholic society, or especially in Brittany. It would have looked as if he would have been living off of his sorcery. That was sort of not very well regarded in the parishes. Another Breton famous witch from Brittany was the witch of Rochefort. Her name was Naya. She was a brilliant, very smart traditional witch. She practiced ventriloquy. She did contortions. She could shapeshift, do all sorts of impossible things with her body. And she was also a flamethrower and necromancy. She also practiced necromancy, cards, and tarots, and all of these things, and also astrology. And the same went for the French-Canadian, which was from the Côte de Beauport. And the Aubert de Gaspé, father and sons, speak much of her. Her name was La Veuve Nollet. She was also called La Mère Nollet, or La Vieille Nollet. She was quite famous as a witch. She also practiced necromancy and practiced astrology and card divining. And so the Aubert de Gaspé, as I mentioned, speak much of her in their books. All of those who collected oral lore and formatted them into very literary tales, sort of like the Grimm brothers in Germany, or Perrault in France, and those who collected the Cavella in Finland, and the Mabinogion, and Lady Charlotte Best in Wales, and so all of these people, like the Marquis de Villemarqué in Brittany, who did collected the material there in Brittany, and the Barzaz-Braise, as it was called. So this about sums it up for today's talk. But before I let you go, I'll show you some of the books here, just to show you. This is Les Anciens Canadiens. Here is a book about well, a book that was written by Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, in which he does mention much of daily life in Canada in the 19th century, at the time of the seigneuries and all this, and where he encounters a Scottish gentleman by the name of Archie Cameron Lochiel, and where they have much discussions about the differences between the Scottish witches and the French-Canadian witches. And Aubert de Gaspé shows Archie Cameron l'île d'Orléans, and he says, well, you know why they called it l'île d'Orléans, l'île des sorciers, the Sorcerer's Island? He says, because there are hundreds of witches, sorcerers living on this island. This dumbfounded Cameron, who wasn't expecting this at all. And so, of course, then afterwards, Philippe Aubert de Gaspé's father explains to him all of this tradition that I just mentioned earlier on. Another one is his son here, Philippe Aubert de Gaspé's son, and this was L'Influence d'un livre, in which he dwells very much into the magic and the cabal of French-Canadian witchcraft in the 19th century. And in the book there is much about the equipment that the sorcerers use, like la médrole. Médrole was also, méduris was a stick used by in Gaul, in ancient Gaul, to as a baguette, as a wand, magical wand. And also the French-Canadian sorcerer, once they were initiated, they would have a cordon, a strap, a blue strap, a cordon bleu. And why a cordon bleu? As you know, with the cooks, the French cuisine, they have a French cordon for a blue cordon. It's because the cordon bleu was associated for the crafts, as I mentioned, with Sainte Anne. It's a third function, as Dumézil would say. It's bleu is associated to blue is the third function of the producers, artisans, artists, and peasants. As for the white curtain, would have been associated to the priestly class, the druids and the bards and all that. And then the red cordon, of course, would have been the aristocracy, the cavaliers, the knights, and the warriors. So, just to sum it up, so in Philippe Aubert de Gaspé, the son, he describes much of this in there. And then we have here some of the scholarly work that was, the collecting that was done, La Sorcellerie au Québec, where a lot of this is explained by Robert Lyonnais Séguin. And from the 17th century to the 19th century in French Canada. And then you have here more modern collecting that was done in the 1950s and 60s by Jean-Claude Dupont. He's an ethnologist, anthropologist from the University of Laval. And this was Le Légendaire de la Beauce, his native Beauce. With Barbeau, he was also from the Beauce region. And here there's a lot of mention. Of course, he mentions Le Pape Giroux. Here is the Pape Giroux here, along with his wife. And this is a photo that he got from Antonio Bolduc, Madame Antonio Bolduc, the wife of Antonio Bolduc, from Beauceville, who was one of the last hereditary warlock leaders, or the Pope of the sorcerers of French Canada. And then we have here, as I mentioned earlier, this Carmen de Roy, who was a collaborator of Marius Barbeau, and this book here it's a collection of folk tales and songs from the Gaspé Peninsula, which is also very rich in traditions. I mentioned earlier about the seigneurie, and Philippe Aubert de Gaspé probably had a seigneurie there too. Here's a book that was made by Louis Lanier, written by Louis Lanier, about Philippe Aubert de Gaspé's son's book, L'influence d'un livre, where he goes through all of the techniques and material that are in Philippe Aubert de Gaspé's book. It's quite an extensive study. And here's my book, Le Livre de Lavoisier, La Chouannerie, which sums up all of this stuff here. And there are many illustrations in it. So if you are interested, it's in French. I haven't translated it yet, but in English. Well, I guess that's all for now. This about sums up my Druid talk for today. So if you enjoyed the talk, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment in the box below. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Dee